There's a question I've started asking new clients, usually in the second or third session, once they feel comfortable enough to answer honestly. I ask if the thing that happened to you, the divorce, the abuse, the betrayal, the loss, if that had never happened, who would you be? Most people pause for a long time before answering, and then, more often than I expected when I started asking, they say something like, I don't know. I can't really picture it. That thing is so much a part of who I am that I'm not sure there's a version of me without it. That pause and that answer is what today's video is about. My name is Sergey Upapovicai. I'm a licensed psychologist based in Munich, and I want to talk about something that sits at the intersection of identity, pain, and recovery, the difference between people who are shaped by their worst experiences and people who are defined by them, because those are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where a lot of suffering either ends or gets extended indefinitely. Let's start with why wounds become identities in the first place, because it doesn't happen randomly, and it isn't a character flaw. When something genuinely painful happens to us, and I'm talking about things that deserve to be called painful, not minor inconveniences, our mind does something intelligent with it. It builds a narrative. It takes the raw, chaotic experience and turns it into a story with a structure, a before, a during, and an after. This is how humans make sense of experience. We are, fundamentally, storytelling animals. We need our experiences to have shape and meaning, and narrative gives us that. The problem isn't that we build stories around our wounds. That's healthy and necessary. The problem is what happens when the wound stops being part of the story and becomes the whole story. When the painful event stops being something that happened to you and becomes something that defines you. There's a clinical term for a particular version of this: identity fusion with trauma. But you don't need the terminology to recognize the pattern. You've seen it in people you know, and if you're watching this video, you may have seen it in yourself. It looks like this. Every new relationship is entered through the lens of the last betrayal. Every professional setback is filtered through the childhood message that you were never good enough. Every risk feels too dangerous because the last time you were vulnerable, it cost you enormously. The wound doesn't just explain the past, it runs the present. Breathe with me for a second, because I want to make sure this lands with the right nuance. I am not suggesting that people choose to be stuck. I am not suggesting that suffering is a decision, or that people who remain in pain simply lack the willpower to move on. That is both psychologically inaccurate and deeply unkind. What I am saying is that there is a process, usually gradual, usually unconscious, by which a wound that was once something that happened to us can slowly migrate to become something we are. And understanding that process is the first step toward interrupting it. So why does it happen? The first reason is that a wound-based identity provides a certain kind of coherence. When life feels chaotic, fragmented, hard to explain, having a central story, even a painful one, gives everything a cause. My relationships fail because of what happened to me. I can't get ahead professionally because of what was done to me in my family. I struggle to trust because of what she did, or what he did, or what they all did. The narrative is painful, but it's coherent. And coherence, to the human mind, is genuinely comforting, even when what it explains is suffering. The second reason is that the wound protects. When my identity is organized around what happened to me, I have a built-in explanation for every future difficulty, and a built-in reason never to take certain risks again. If I failed because of my trauma, then my trauma is also, in some way, my shield. It explains my limits before I have to test them. It keeps me from trying, and therefore from failing, in the ways that frighten me most after the original injury. This is not cynical. This is the psyche doing its job, which is, above all, to protect you from more pain. The problem is that it does this job by keeping you small and still, long after the original danger has passed. The third reason is community. This one is harder to name, but it's real. Sometimes, especially in groups organized around shared experiences of harm, a wound-based identity becomes a social belonging. Departing from it, healing, growing, finding a way forward, can feel like a betrayal of the community, or a suggestion that what happened wasn't really that bad. It can feel like leaving people behind, and so the wound is kept alive, in part, because releasing it would mean releasing a form of connection. Breathe in and out. None of these reasons make a wound-based identity good for you, but they make it understandable, and understanding is where the work of change always begins. Now I want to talk about the people who come through devastating experiences and find their way to something different, not because they suffered less, but because of what they did with the suffering. There is a concept in psychology that has gathered substantial research support over the last 3 decades, called post-traumatic growth. It refers to positive psychological change that emerges not despite deeply challenging life experiences, but through the process of struggling with them. It's different from resilience, which is essentially the capacity to bounce back. Post-traumatic growth goes further. It describes people who come out of their worst experiences genuinely different in ways they often describe as meaningful or even, with appropriate complexity, as worth something. This doesn't mean the trauma was good. It doesn't mean they'd choose to go through it again. It means that the struggle itself, the painful, effortful, often ugly work of wrestling with what happened, generated something real. What tends to distinguish people who experience post-traumatic growth from those who remain in prolonged suffering is not the severity of what happened to them. Some of the most profound examples of post-traumatic growth emerge from the most extreme experiences. What tends to distinguish them is what they do with the question of meaning. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and wrote extensively about his experience, put it this way: we cannot always choose what happens to us, but we can choose the attitude we take toward it. He wasn't suggesting that suffering is trivial. He was suggesting that even in the presence of suffering we cannot escape, the meaning we make of it remains, to some degree, ours. Research since Frankl has refined this considerably. We now know that finding meaning in a difficult experience doesn't require finding a reason it happened. The idea that everything happens for a reason is philosophically contested and often emotionally harmful. What it does require is finding something that emerged from the experience that has value, a clearer sense of priorities, a deeper capacity for empathy, a relationship that wouldn't exist without the crisis, a version of yourself that is stronger in specific ways precisely because you had to be. The difference between being shaped by your wound and being defined by it often comes down to exactly this: whether the experience remains a chapter in your story, or whether it swallows the narrative entirely. A chapter has context. It has what came before and what comes after. It's part of a longer arc that belongs to you, not the other way around. When the wound becomes the whole story, there is no before and no after. There is only the injury, endlessly present, endlessly explaining everything, endlessly limiting what feels possible. So how does someone begin to move from one to the other? I want to offer 3 things that I've seen matter in practice, not as a checklist, but as an honest account of what the process tends to look like. The first is grieving fully before moving on. This might seem counterintuitive in a video about not staying stuck, but one of the most common reasons people remain frozen in their wound is that they never actually grieved it. They managed it, survived it, intellectualized it, minimized it, got busy to avoid it, but they never sat with the actual weight of what they lost. And grief that hasn't been completed doesn't disappear. It gets stored. It influences behavior in ways that feel mysterious until you trace them back to their source. Full grieving means allowing yourself to feel the actual scope of what happened, not just the original event, but what it cost you, the future you thought you were going to have, the trust you used to carry more easily, the version of yourself that existed before. These are real losses, and they deserve to be mourned, not skipped. People who do this work, often, honestly, with professional support, tend to find that what was blocking them wasn't the wound itself, but the unprocessed grief around it. Grief, when it's allowed to move, moves. What stays frozen tends to be grief that hasn't had permission. The second thing is reauthoring the narrative. This is a concept that comes from narrative therapy, developed by Michael White and David Epstein. The basic idea is that we all carry dominant narratives about ourselves, the main story we tell about who we are, and that these narratives are not fixed truths but constructions that can be examined and carefully rebuilt. When the wound has become the dominant narrative, reauthoring means finding what narrative therapists call unique outcomes, the moments in your story that don't fit the dominant plot, the times you coped, the moments when the old pattern didn't apply. The evidence, however small, a version of you that exists alongside the wound and isn't reducible to it. This isn't positive thinking in the shallow sense. It's not telling yourself a story that denies what happened. It's insisting on the full complexity of who you are, which includes what happened to you, and also includes everything that isn't explained by it. The third thing is taking action that the wound says you can't. This is often the last thing to arrive, because it requires a degree of internal readiness that the previous work tends to build toward. But at some point, the wound-based identity tends to test itself against reality, and often finds that reality tells a different story. Maybe you were told, directly or indirectly, that you weren't capable of real intimacy after what happened to you. And then, carefully, slowly, you build a relationship that disproved that. Maybe you believed that your professional life would always be limited by what happened in your family. And then you built something, small at first, then larger, that existed outside of that story. These actions don't erase the wound, but they revise the story it tells about your future. They are evidence, gathered in real life, that the wound's predictions were not entirely accurate. I want to close with something that I think is often missing from conversations about healing, and that I want to name directly. Choosing not to be defined by your wound is not the same as saying the wound wasn't real, wasn't serious, wasn't deserved. People who hurt you deserve accountability. Harm that was done to you deserved to not happen. Nothing about healing requires you to soften your understanding of what occurred. What it requires is something more radical. The decision that whoever or whatever caused your wound does not get to write the rest of your story. That the worst chapter someone else put you through, or that life put you through, is not the chapter that defines the arc. Your worst chapter can become a first chapter, not because pain is secretly good, but because you are the author of what comes next, regardless of who wrote what came before. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the most profound forms of autonomy available to a human being. If this video helped you see something a little differently today, consider sharing it with someone who might need it. Subscribe if you want more psychology content grounded in real clinical practice. And if you're in the Munich area and would like to work through any of this personally, my contact information is in the description below. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.